The concept of identity is really complex and diverse. It is not concrete, it is an ongoing construction. For this, we have to understand that individual identities are also social and even sometimes political. Identity is more like an action in which we take part. It is dynamic and present even before we are born. There are some tools that help us analyze it, such as categorization, comparison, and identification. Recognition is also an important part of identity since it is important to be seen, valued, and respected. That's why identity can become political, and it is important when talking about human rights, especially in vulnerable populations.
Recognition is essential in the construction of identity because we do not define ourselves completely on our own. The way others see, accept, or label us can influence how we understand ourselves and our place in society. When people receive positive recognition, they can develop a stronger sense of belonging and self-worth. However, when recognition is based on stereotypes or prejudice, it can create a false or distorted identity. Different actors influence this process, such as a family, friends, school, communities, the media, and government institutions. At the same time, structural conditions like culture, social norms, economic inequality, gender expectations, and laws also shape how identities are constructed and recognized. This is why recognition can either support a family's identity or contribute to exclusion and discrimination.
The vulnerable group we identify is people with disabilities, both in Mexico and globally. According to the World Health Organization, an estimate of 1.3 billion people, 16% of the global population, live with a significant disability. In Mexico, INEGI's 2020 census found that 16.5% of the population reports some form of disability or functional limitation. Maria Isabela Toledo's constructivist perspective helps explain why this group suffers false recognition. Toledo argues identity is not fixed or something we simply belong to, but something in constant construction, shaped heavily by context and by others around us. This connects directly to Axel Honneth's theory of recognition, which argues identity building results from intersubjective acts of recognition, and that these processes are never expense of power relations. For people with disabilities, this false recognition isn't accidental. It's a product of who holds the power to define normal bodies and minds in society, reflects in accessible infrastructure, exclusionary schools, and media that reinforces pity or fear instead of respect. We identify three key characteristics of this false identity. The first one is the capacitive narrative. Society constructs disability as synonymous with inability. In Mexico, INEGI reports that in 2020 the labor participation rate for people with disabilities aged 15 and older was just 38% compared to 67% of people without disability, nearly half the rate. This gap isn't due to lack of capability, but to inaccessibility, workplace, and higher discrimination, showing the false identity is imposed by exclusion, not by actual limitation. The second one is the infantilization. Adults with disabilities are frequently spoken to or decided for, as if they were children, stripped of autonomy over their own bodies, finances, and relationships. This reflects Honneth's point that false recognition is tied to power relations. Those with power define who gets to make decisions for others. And the third one is inspiration stereotype, sometimes called inspiration porn. Media often frames ordinary achievements by people with disabilities, going to school, playing sports, working a job, as extraordinary or heroic, while seemingly positive, this flattens their identity into a symbol for able-bodied audience, rather than recognizing them as complex individuals with ordinary goals and struggles. Together, these three characteristics shows that this false identity isn't accidental, it's produced by structural conditions.
The false identity which is described has real consequences, not just abstract ones. The first one is economic exclusion. Since disability gets framed as incapacity, employers hesitate to hire, which explains why only 38% of people with disabilities in Mexico participate in the labor force, compared to the 67% of people without disabilities. According to the INEGI, that's not a skills gap, it's a recognition gap that traps people into poverty and dependency. The second consequence is the loss of autonomy caused by infantilization. When adults with disabilities are treated as incapable of deciding for themselves, they lose control over basic choices like where to live, who to marry, or how to manage their own money, which directly violates their dignity as equal adults. Together, these consequences show that false recognition doesn't just misrepresent this group, it actively limits their freedom and their rights.
As we've seen, false identities are not created by the vulnerable group itself, but by stereotypes, misinformation, and discrimination that society reinforces. To reduce this problem, we need real actions. First, governments and social media platforms should strengthen policies against hate speech and misinformation while quickly removing content that spreads harmful stereotypes about vulnerable groups. Second, schools should include diversity and digital literacy programs that teach students how to identify stereotypes, verify information, and understand different cultures from an early age. These actions address both the source of false recognition and the way it spreads. In a global society, recognizing people based on who they really are, not on prejudice or misinformation, is essential for building inclusion, equal opportunities, and respect for everyone's identity.